Well, good morning. I'm Rob Kolb, Pastor Bob's wingman. I like that. I'm a wingman. Okay. And since no one complained to me about the history lesson last week, you get another one. But first, a quick recap. We learned last week that the Jews have contributed more to world civilization than any other people, and yet they make the rest of the world crazy. I talked about Israel and the Jews since the time Rome defeated them in AD 70, and that event killed over 1 million Jews and completely destroyed Jerusalem. And those who survived were driven out of the land. One story you're familiar with from those days is what happened at Masada, a fortress by the Dead Sea where the Jews made a historic last stand against the Romans, and when all was lost, they committed mass suicide rather than be taken alive. But did you know that over the ages, Jews have considered that a shameful event in their history, a story only told as a lesson in the futility of resisting against hopeless odds? It's only since 1948, when Israel became a nation again, that Masada has become a source of pride and patriotism. But there was another story that happened at the same time as Masada that is much more important to the history of the Jews. And you haven't heard this story. During the Roman siege of Jerusalem, most of the population died, including the temple priests, the Sanhedrin, and all the noble families. However, a small number of Jews, including a few rabbis, managed to escape, and they hid out in a small village called Jabna. There they prayed and studied, and when the war was over, miraculously, this little community was overlooked by the Romans, and they survived. They established a school, and the rabbis started writing new rules for Jewish life and worship now that they had no temple and no homeland, and they wrote rules meant to govern Jewish communities, like how many families it takes to establish a synagogue, and what ceremonies replace the temple sacrifice, and what festivals to observe. Many of these are the same rules that Jews follow today. But most significantly, at Jabna, the decision was made that Jews should abstain from violence and aggression, even when attacked. As these new rules spread among the dispersed Jews, there was near universal acceptance. This became known as Rabbinical Judaism, and the Jews became the first people ever ruled as a cathodocracy, which means rule by teacher. The most revered man in the community was the rabbi, and if there was no rabbi, the wisest scholar was their spiritual leader. Merchants were always consulted, but never in charge. They represented the economic life of the community. I tell you this story because it was this denunciation of nationalism, militarism, and zealotry that saved the Jewish people from mass destruction. Through 2 millennia of endless wars, exiles, and persecution, the Jews became the ultimate passive adapters. It also answers a question people ask about the Holocaust. Why didn't the Jews fight back? They accepted long ago, if you acquiesce, some die. If you resist, many die. To Jews, Holocaust survivors aren't considered heroes, they're survivors, and that is what counts. A few weeks ago, during his 4th of July Freedom Sermon, Pastor Bob said, America was blessed because it was founded on biblical principles and a faith in God. And of course, that's true. But there's something else about America's blessings. After all, many great nations were Christian nations. Spain, Italy, France, England, all were great world powers, and the church played important roles in their governance. but they all missed something. The part about who God blesses and who God curses. So is it true? Does God really bless those who bless Israel and curse those who curse Israel? As we saw last week, the Gentile world has not tried very hard to bless Israel, Christians included. Historians study events, and over the centuries, the most common recurring event is war. It's war that creates kingdoms, countries, and empires, and it's war that destroys kingdoms, countries, and empires. I love the names they give those old wars. The 7 Years' War, the 30 Years' War, the 80 Years' War, the 100 Years' War. And when constant war didn't make life miserable enough for soldiers and civilians, there were other events to mark the passage of time, like foreign invasions that killed hundreds of thousands, famines that killed millions, and then there were the plagues that killed tens of millions. Almost half the population of Europe died from the Black Death. In other words, historians have had plenty of curses to write about. And those Christian nations that once ruled continents, they're now mostly godless societies headed for hell. But let's look at the exception. Last week, I told you the story of Haym Salomon, who played a key role in the success of the American Revolution. I said he represented the beginning of a new era for the Jews. It's a fascinating story how the Jews first came to America, because they predated the Germans, the Irish, and many others by decades. But that story didn't make the cut. When the English captured New Amsterdam from the Dutch in 1664, Jewish merchants were already here, well established and providing crucial services so they were tolerated. And I can't keep this on. Tolerance was about the best Jews ever hoped for. By the time Haym was helping win the Revolutionary War, there were an estimated 5,000 Jews in America. And because of people like Haym and some Christians who actually read their Bibles, the Jews experienced something they hadn't in over 1,700 years. More than acceptance, more than tolerance. They were equals. George Washington said that Jews would not be a tolerated minority, but would possess all the liberties of conscience and the immunities of citizenship. John Adams, the second president, called the Jews the most glorious nation that ever inhabited the earth. He argued that Jews had influenced the affairs of mankind more than any other nation, modern or ancient. And in a letter I quoted last week, he said, God has ordained the Jews to be the most essential instrument for civilizing nations. And guess what? More Jews came to America. By the time of the Civil War, there were about 50,000 Jews, mostly in the North, and most of the eligible men enlisted. They were American patriots. And when the war effort got in financial trouble again, guess who came to the rescue? Again. Joseph Seligman was a successful international businessman who, when war broke out, loaned the Union government $1 million. And he donated thousands of uniforms made in his factories. When it was obvious the government was going to need a lot more money, Seligman called on his vast network of business connections in Europe, and he persuaded them to buy $200 million worth of bonds. Once again, making a Jew the primary financier that kept America from collapse. I teased this story last week. In 1863, after his victory at Vicksburg, General Ulysses S. Grant issued General Order Number 11, expelling all Jews from Tennessee, Mississippi, and Kentucky. Grant's rationale was the Jews were so helpful to the Union cause, they were probably helping the Confederates as well, which of course they were. Jewish leaders in the North protested and spoke with President Lincoln in person, who immediately rescinded the order, earning him the nickname Father Abraham. Lincoln even signed a law requiring the chaplain corps to include rabbis, the first law specifically benefiting Jews. While Jews were thriving in America, the story was very different in Russia. Over 5 million Jews lived in an area of southwest Russia known as the Pale of Settlement. Jews were not allowed to go beyond the pale. And now you know where we got the saying, that's beyond the pale. In 1881, the Jews were blamed for the assassination of Tsar Alexander, and a pogrom was conducted, killing thousands of Jews and leaving many more homeless. A pogrom is an organized massacre or expulsion of helpless people, usually Jews, and pogroms were not uncommon. Life became intolerable for millions of Jews, and those that could escaped, trying if possible to get to America, nicknamed the New Jerusalem. But for the first time in centuries, some Jews chose instead to walk all the way from Russia to the real Jerusalem. These folks were the first Zionist returners, and Jews are still returning today. Those Jews were usually referred to as Palestinians because the area they settled was labeled Palestine on the maps. The first Jewish newspaper was called the Palestinian Post. Decades later, it was renamed the Jerusalem Post, and it's Israel's largest newspaper. Jews in America, hearing the plight of their kindred in Russia, raised money to pay passage for thousands of these refugees. When the Statue of Liberty was dedicated in 1886, included was a poem written and donated by a Jewish woman named Emma Lazarus. Her poem was specifically written for her fellow Jews escaping Russia. You remember how it goes. Give me your poor, you're tired, you're poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send those, the homeless, the tempest-tossed, to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. A prominent American preacher named William Blackstone wrote a best-selling book called Jesus is Coming in 1878. In the book, Blackstone stated emphatically that Israel must be restored as a nation before Jesus can return. When the refugees started pouring in during the 1880s, American Christians welcomed these destitute people with charity and help finding jobs. Christians called them the lost Hebrews. They also told the Jews that they would soon have a homeland of their own. This was news to the lost Hebrews. As the history books will tell you, modern Zionism started a decade later in Europe. But in fact, Zionism was started by American Christians who read their Bibles. Zionism is a belief that the Jews have the right to live in Israel, and that right was given to them by God. We should all be Zionists. Reverend Blackstone chaired a conference on Zionism in 1890 and presented President Benjamin Harrison with a declaration that came out of that conference. It urged the United States to support a Jewish homeland and to condemn Russia for its treatment of the Jews. When a group of Jewish leaders in Europe finally convened their own Zionist conference in 1896, they endorsed what has since become known as Blackstone's Memorial. And these European Jews recognized, maybe for the first time, there were Gentiles who actually wanted to help them. The history of the Zionist movement, right up until Israel became a nation, is another fascinating story. But I had to cut that one too. What we remember is the plight of the Jews right before World War II. We all learned the causes and effects of World War I and World War II from the world's point of view in our history books. Let's consider those causes and effects from a different point of view. Why was World War I fought? Possibly because it included the defeat of the Ottomans, the annexing of Palestine by Britain, and Lord Balfour giving an accord recommending the Jews be given the land of Palestine for a homeland. World War I is what prepared the land of Israel to receive the Jewish people. Why was World War II fought? If you look at the shameful betrayal of the Jews by the whole world, enabling the Nazi Holocaust and then the Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe, World War II was what prepared the Jewish people to receive their land of Israel. I'll say that again. World War I prepared the Jewish land for the Jewish people, and World War II prepared the Jewish people to return to their land. And just an aside, Hitler never used the term Holocaust. That was applied after the fact. But Hitler made no secret of his plans to conduct a pogrom on the Jews. And that didn't really alarm anyone. Practically every European nation had a pogrom against the Jews sometime or another. Mistreating and even killing Jews was just not big news. By the way, the word Holocaust in the original Greek means burnt offering. Since we're in the period of the two world wars, I've just got to tell this one story. Next week, I'm going to expand on this theme. But this is a great don't poke God in the eye story. Greatly condensed, of course. September 1938 was one of the most consequential months of the 20th century. Earlier, in March of 1938, Austrian-born Adolf Hitler managed to take the whole country of Austria by intrigue without firing a shot. Still, the idea of a European country being taken over by another one and no one says a thing, that was ominous. So Hitler pushed. This time in September by demanding the Sudetenland, which was a large chunk of Czechoslovakia. Neville Chamberlain appeased. Franklin Roosevelt vacillated. So Czechoslovakia, a sovereign nation with no allies to help, was divided up. And 6 months later, all of Czechoslovakia belonged to Germany. It was this weak, shameful betrayal of an ally in September 1938 that gave Hitler the green light to execute his master plan. And tens of thousands more Jews were caught in his trap, and most would be dead soon. Do you believe that God gives us warnings? I do. But we have to be paying attention. In September 1938, a hurricane developed off of Cape Verde. It strengthened into a Category 5 storm and headed straight towards Florida, the second one in 3 years. Florida watched the storm carefully, but the rest of the nation was completely preoccupied with the daily headlines out of Europe. Then the storm weakened, turned, and was forgotten. But a freak weather pattern of 2 high-pressure systems squeezed that storm back to life, causing its forward speed to hit 70 miles an hour, a record that still stands. The strong Category 3 hurricane slammed into an unsuspecting New England. It was devastating in property and lives lost. That storm impacted more American lives than any previous event in U.S. history. The storm was dubbed the Long Island Express due to its speed and its first landfall on Long Island. I'm going to switch thoughts now, so stay with me. Many German Americans were saddened by the defeat of Germany in World War I, but the subsequent economic disaster and suffering of their native countrymen was heartbreaking. Then when things started turning around for their old homeland, they were proud and supportive. In fact, many German Americans joined an organization called the Bund, which actively supported the new German government and its inspiring young leader, Adolf Hitler. They even built a camp called Camp Siegfried to stage large rallies and show their support, which included wearing German uniforms and adopting the Heil Hitler greeting. The camp's main road was named Hitler Street. Yes, we had a road named after Adolf Hitler in America. The camp was located next to Yaphank, Long Island, a few miles directly north of where the Long Island Express first made landfall. Barely a tree was left standing as Camp Siegfried took a direct hit. The New York Times headline the next day read, "Czechoslovakia lost," and "Monster storm sweeps New England." I know you don't believe those two things are related, just a coincidence. Next week, I'm going to tell you about a whole lot more coincidences. But back to blessings and curses. Let me share an excellent case study in what blessings and curses look like. Compare the United States with Russia since the beginning of the Zionist movement in the 1880s. We're very similar countries in size, in population, in natural resources, and in fertile land. But I don't need any slides to remind you what a different experience Americans have had compared to the Russians over those years. That's what blessings and curses look like. And since I mentioned Russia, it's been a mystery to many why that country has had such an unnatural hatred of Jews. But the answer can be found in the Bible. It was prophesied that the land to the north, called Rosh in the Bible, would attack Israel more than once, including at least one more major attack in the future. If you draw a line, which I don't think I can do, straight north from where we're at here is Israel. If you go straight north, you'll hit Moscow. And before 1480, the area around Moscow was called the Kingdom of Rosh. Then in 1948, it became official, and the Jews were given British Palestine as their new homeland, Israel. Well, almost. What was originally proposed was for the entire British mandate to be given to Israel, but after much complaining from the Arabs, this is what they ended up with. Before they even got started, the Jews had lost 77% of their land to the enemies. You've heard it said that the land really belongs to the Palestinians. The land of Israel was renamed Palestine by the Romans in 100 AD. You can see it on the far right of that map insert that's in the bulletin. The name means land of the Philistines. And it was meant as an insult to the defeated Jews. Philistines were the arch enemy of Israel for centuries, but they were never Arabs. Philistines migrated from Greece to Crete and then to the shore of the eastern Mediterranean, where they built 5 cities near the coast. And it wasn't until the 1950s that a guy named Yasser Arafat thought of calling the local Arabs Palestinians. Israel always has been and always will be the promised land God gave to Abraham 4,000 years ago. So what was the first thing to happen to the new country? A few thousand, mostly unarmed civilians and mostly untrained, had to fight 100-to-1 odds against 5 Arab armies that wanted every Jew dead or gone. But God miraculously fulfilled his promise, and the last thing that needed to happen before Christ's return was done. And when Christ comes back again the second time, he's not leaving. He will be King of Kings and Lord of Lords, and the government will be on his shoulders, and hundreds of other prophecies will be fulfilled. In the meantime, the Jews have had to put up with attack after attack, usually by vastly superior numbers, and miracle after miracle has preserved and prospered them. How has the rest of the world repaid the Jews for all their contributions that make our lives so much better? I'm going to read from an article written last year. I quote, "The UN General Assembly approved 15 anti-Israel resolutions last year, 2022, versus 13 resolutions criticizing all the other countries combined. Russia had 6 resolutions condemning its invasion of Ukraine. North Korea, Afghanistan, Myanmar, Syria, Iran, and the U.S. were hit with 1 resolution each. Saudi Arabia, China, Lebanon, Turkey, Venezuela, Qatar, all these have poor human rights records or are involved in regional conflicts and were not dinged by any resolutions." I'm still quoting. Since 2015, the General Assembly has adopted 140 resolutions criticizing Israel, mainly over its treatment of the Palestinians. Over the same period, it has passed 68 resolutions against all other countries combined. I'm still quoting. "Make no mistake, the purpose of the lopsided condemnations is to demonize the Jewish state," end quote. Just think about that. 140 resolutions condemning Israel versus 68 against all the other nations combined. Since the UN Human Rights Commission was created in 2006, it too has passed more resolutions condemning Israel than any other country of all the other countries of the world combined. Human rights violations. It's insanely absurd. I mean, Iran has a seat on the Human Rights Commission. So does Cuba, Somalia, and China. Almost 2.5 million Arabs work and live in Israel. Jews, on the other hand, are barred from living in, working in, or even visiting most Islamic countries. When I visited Israel, they didn't even stamp my passport. When I asked why, I was told many countries won't let you in if they see an Israeli stamp. Back in 1975, UN Resolution 3379 was passed, which determined that Zionism is a form of racism and racial discrimination. In other words, Israel is racist because it's Israel. When the young nation was attacked by 4 Arab armies in 1967, what we call the Six-Day War, those armies suffered one of the most lopsided defeats in history. Israel drove the Jordanians off the Golan Heights and retook Jerusalem, their capital, which was land that was originally given to them anyway. Immediately after the humiliating defeat, the Arabs called Israel occupiers and demanded the return of the territory that they lost. The UN passed a resolution condemning Israel and called for economic sanctions and an arms embargo on Israel until they withdrew from all territories occupied in 1967. That's completely unheard of in the history of warfare. To the loser go the spoils. And since the Six-Day War, Israel has been attacked 9 more times. The biggest scare came in 1973. Russia had been supplying Syria and Egypt with their best weapons and training so they could attack Israel from the north and south with almost no chance of Israel surviving. The Yom Kippur War of 1973 caught everyone off guard. The Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir pleaded with the European countries for support, and not one helped. It wasn't a secret that the U.S. President, Richard Nixon, a Quaker, did not like Jews. So Golda Meir approached Henry Kissinger, the Secretary of State, a fellow Jew, asking if the U.S. could help. Kissinger knew that the Arab oil countries would retaliate by withholding oil if they knew the U.S. was helping Israel. So he proposed the U.S. help by letting Israel send El Al passenger planes to the U.S. to secretly pick up supplies for the war. The U.S. at that time was drowning in military surplus because the fighting had just ended in Vietnam. But when that effort to resupply Israel wasn't nearly enough, Kissinger suggested to Nixon that we use some commercial cargo and passenger planes to carry supplies. But for some unknown reason, Nixon said no. He said, use the Air Force. In fact, his exact words to Kissinger were, send everything that will fly. Over the next 2 weeks, the U.S. flew 50,000 tons of supplies and munitions to Israel. Russia couldn't keep up with the losses Egypt and Syria were suffering, so after 19 days, the much smaller Israeli army prevailed again. Arab losses were triple that of Israel, and they lost some more territory. A little-known fact, the Arab nations could not stand the idea of another loss to Israel, so they proclaimed it a victory and immediately cut off oil shipments to the U.S. Some of you remember that. Next came the intifadas, the terror bombings, and the rocket attacks, until here we are again. Israel is fighting a war they didn't start, and everyone is mad at Israel. But more about that next week. I'll conclude the series with just a little bit more history, and then we'll switch to Israel's future and the prophecies regarding Israel during the end times and into the millennium. Our takeaway from last week, in case you forgot, is anti-Semitism is anti-God. Our takeaway this week is to be reminded that God is sovereign. His plan is unfolding according to His will. And that plan includes Israel, whether the rest of the world likes it or not. The world is not spinning out of control, and things are not falling apart. In fact, things are falling into place. It's very hard to cover 1,900 years of history in such a short time. I've left some huge gaps, and I've painted with a pretty broad brush. But I do it with the hope that you'll step back and take another look at history, this time from this point of view. Are we in the end times? As I read the signs, I say absolutely. But regardless, we need to stay focused on the Lord and keep an eye on Israel. If you want to know more, you can read all about it. God wrote it all down for us. Father, thank you for your word. It says you don't want us to be ignorant, but to trust the plans you have for us. That plan includes all that is happening in the world. We have no need to fear, knowing you are in control. And while the world stumbles in the darkness, help us be that lighthouse in the storm. We love you, Lord. We thank you for your many blessings. We thank you for your word that tells us your plan. And Lord, we thank you that you are watching out over everything as your plan unfolds. We thank you for this time of worship together this morning, and I pray a blessing on each person and their day as they leave this place. Pray these things in Jesus' holy name. Amen.